Okay, so we just reviewed the 4 capital stems of the Majuscule alphabet, and now we will look at 3 entry elements. So the entry element is basically it's a secondary shape where the capital stem is the main backbone and the entry element usually leads into the stem. And so there are 3 basic entry elements. And the first one is called an indirect oval. And the reason it's called indirect is because you make it in the opposite direction. So normally you make an oval what is this, counterclockwise, where the shade is on the left. So indirect is the opposite direction. I'm just going to draw an indirect oval, and then I'm going to make the entry element. So this is starting here and going counterclockwise, and the indirect is going the opposite way. So this is how you normally make ovals with the shade on the left, and this is with the shade on the right. So I would recommend practicing making some indirect ovals. And then for this entry element, if this is our baseline, our header line, our first ascender, and our second ascender, the capital stems that we were making, so like the universal line of beauty, start at the second ascender and come down to the baseline. So they're 3 spaces tall. And the first entry element that we're looking at right now is the indirect oval. This will take up the top 2 spaces. So it'll be above the header line, between the header line and the second ascender. Okay, so the indirect oval, you can start a little bit below the second ascender. So that's this line. I started about halfway between the first and second ascender right here. You could start a little higher, a little lower if you want when you're making the letters, but I would recommend starting a little below the second ascender. And then we come down, make a shade on the right, come back up, and then reach the second ascender. So again, starting a little bit below the second ascender, coming down, make this oval shape, but instead of meeting it here, you just come back up. So if you were to continue and meet this oval like that, then it would be an oval. But you want to continue up and then hug this line. Okay, I'm using a Hunt 101 nib, and so these hairlines are really fine. So if you're having a hard time seeing, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay, and this shade, you see how the shade that I made for this universal line of beauty was pretty thick. It's the normal shade width that I would make using this nib. So for the entry element, you want to make it a little less thick. It's a secondary shade, so it shouldn't be the same width as this shade. It should be a little bit less. And when we make letters, you'll see why. So again, you don't want to make it extremely thick. Okay, now I'm going to show you 3 variations, and all of them have this part is the same, and then once you get to about this point, there are 3 different ways to end it. Okay, so the first one is the most simple. So again, we have let's call this our second ascender, first header, and baseline. And when you're practicing these shapes individually, it doesn't really matter, but just for some context for later on. So the first way to make it, start with the indirect oval, and then when you get to the second ascender, you're just going to continue with this horizontal line that dips a little bit below the second ascender and back up. So make the oval and reach the second ascender, then dip down and back up. okay, just very slightly. When you're making this shape, when you're making a letter, you can also come back in after you make the hairline, come back in with another hairline and add a little bit of shading at the end of it. Another way, if you like to use a straight holder when you write, this might be a little bit easier, but you can do it with an oblique holder. You just have to stop when you get here, and when you make this curved part, if you turn your pen you can add thickness to that wavy part. Okay, so the first way that this indirect oval ends is with this horizontal line, and I would recommend just practicing it like these first two, where you just come in the oval shape, come up, slight dip down, and back up. Okay, so that's the first variation. The second variation, and honestly this is the hardest for me to make. The next one, I'm going to ignore these lines, I'm just going to start it right here, but starts the same way with this indirect oval, come up to the second line, continue around with another indirect oval, except you stop right here. So it's pretty much the same shape as this, maybe a little bit more curved on the side, and this will be in letter B, the letter P. So again, indirect oval, come up, around, and make this shade. This shade should again not be as thick as this shade, but it could be maybe a little thicker than this. When we start making the letters, it'll be more obvious how to create balance when you're making these shapes. So this should be one continuous shape, and one way you can practice this is by making continuous indirect ovals, which is a lot harder than it looks. So trying to keep the spacing from here to here and from here to here to be the same, and these should both be oval shapes in here. Okay, so that I call this part a clockwise curved shade. I don't really know if there's a better name for it, but so anyway, again, this is the indirect oval entry element connected to this curved shade. Okay, lastly we have the same indirect oval, and we're going to connect it to the shade of a compound curve. Okay, so in a compound curve, for a minuscule letter you would make it 1x height, or 1 height, but right now I'm going to make it bigger. So this is the compound curve shape, and this middle section of it, we have this swell, and this shape right here should basically be the same as this shape right here. So coming down in a compound curve. So rather than with this one we came down and curved back in, here we're curving down and then to the right. Okay, and you'll see this in the letter Y. You'll also see it in the letter U, except with the U you're going to come down and make this compound curve shade 3 spaces tall. So you could also practice that. Alright, so that's entry element number 1, the indirect oval. Let's move on to number 2. And this is pretty simple. It's an extended compound curve. So if we look at this compound curve shape, basically it's going to be the same thing, except the entrance stroke is going to be, the entrance stroke and exit stroke are going to be taller than the shade. So this is also between the second ascender, the first, and sorry, the header line and the second ascender. So for this one, I like to start around the header line and then come up and make this compound curve shape up to the second ascender. So the actual shade is about 1x height, except shifted up so that it starts halfway between the second ascender and first ascender and ends halfway between the header and the first ascender. So again, starting at the header line, come up above the first ascender, curve around, make the swell, and then come back up. And when you're making this, you can be a little bit more free and make this part a little bit more curved rather than straight. You can kind of experiment with this when you're actually making the letters. Sometimes the exit stroke doesn't go all the way up to the second ascender depending on what you're connecting it to. Okay, so that one's pretty simple. And lastly, we have our third entry element, which is a horizontal oval. So the horizontal oval, normally, again, we make the oval upright like this so that the length of it is along the axis, along the 55-degree axis. But if we, instead of making it this way, we're going to turn it on its side, the shade will still be on the left-hand side, but we're going to think of it as being in this plane. Okay, so this is, if I draw an oval that's wider than it is tall, so this is why it's called a horizontal oval rather than a vertical oval. I'll just draw one for reference next to it. So pretty much the same shape except on its side. However, the shade is still on the left side. But for this one, the axis is horizontal, and this one, the axis is vertical. So you're going to basically follow this horizontal shape, starting, this is again between the header line and the second ascender, so above the header line. We'll start right here, come around, and then back up. And this one kind of depends on which letter you're going into, how you end it. We'll go over that when we write the letters, but basically you want to start between the first and second ascender, come over to the left, make a shade, go down to almost the header line. You can play around with how far down you go, and then back up towards the second ascender. And for some shapes you will continue and curve back inward, or maybe curving down, but this is the basic shape, is the horizontal oval. So these are the three entry elements. Again, we have the indirect oval. This is the basic shape, and there are three ways to end the indirect oval. The first is by coming out and making a horizontal curve to the right. The second is by continuing with another clockwise shaded curve. And the third is by ending with the compound curve shape. And then lastly, we have the extended compound curve and the the horizontal oval. So indirect oval, horizontal oval, and extended compound curve. Okay, so now you know the 4 capital stems and their variations, plus the 3 entry elements and their variations. So now we will look at how to put them together and make the majuscule letters.